Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. This is Joanna Lalikas with NC State University. I'll be moderating in the background today for the most part. We've got Dave Lamy from Clemson University on with us today. He'll be talking about community and economic impact potential of local food systems. Quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with the webinar platform, you'll want to set up your audio if you've not already using the little button that looks like a microphone and red flower at the top of the audio and video. You can adjust your audio volume there. If one of us is louder or softer than the other, please feel free to use that. This is the talk button. In case you have a question, you can raise your hand using this icon and the participant bar, and then once we call on you, you can use the talk button to speak. And we also have the chat box. This will be the preferred method of asking questions, which we'll take at the end of the session. You can just type your questions in there and we'll answer those at the end. Quickly, I wanted to thank our sponsors. We have been working for over a year to develop a series of sessions for a local food systems course, which is in session right now, a graduate course for extension agents. This particular webinar is one of the in-between session components of that course. We have several webinars that we're opening it up broadly to extension educators across North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. We also have some support through NC Growing Together. Thank you also to our collaborators. We've had the great pleasure over the last year or so to be working with folks from all of these institutions to put together the graduate course as well as the concepts for these webinars in between sessions, as well as a number of other amazing collaborators working in local food systems. So just a thank you for all of that. So quickly, I wanted to introduce Dave Lamy. Dave is an associate professor in the School of Agriculture, Forestry, and Environmental Sciences at Clemson University. He's affiliated with the Clemson Institute for Economic and Community Development in Columbia, South Carolina, where he directs the South Carolina New and Beginning Farmer Program, the South Carolina Market Maker Program, and the South Carolina Market Ready Program. He works closely and extensively with county extension staff on helping to create sustainable local food systems. He also serves as the chair of the board of the South Carolina Food Policy Council and serves on the Midlands Local Food Coalition Steering Committee. He's affiliated with the EU-funded Project Innovation in the Teaching of Sustainable Development in the Life Sciences in Europe and is a charter member of the ISLE Association. He's currently the president of the International Community Development Society, and he's recently led study tours for students and professionals under the theme Local and Regional Food Systems in a Global Economy. Before I hand over to Dave, I just want to mention to folks on the phone who have called in, please do mute your telephone. Otherwise, we hear the things going on in the background. And now, Dave, if you would unmute, I will hand this session over to you.
Okay, Joanna, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, welcome all. I think I look forward to having a conversation with you today about the community and economic impact potential of local food systems. I'm assuming we're all here today because we have an interest in local food systems and see that potential there for ourselves and for our organizations. And one of the questions that often comes to us, no matter what we're doing in terms of, say, extension programming, and I assume most, if not all of us here are extension employees. If not, that's fine. It doesn't matter who you work for, but people want to know kind of what's the return on investment for the work we're engaged in. Is there a social benefit to what we're doing? Is there something that's measurable that we can eventually turn into dollars and cents, because that seems to be the way we like to measure most of our things these days. And so doesn't mean it's necessarily the most important way to measure things. We can talk about that a little bit if you want. But I think it's useful for us to start thinking about just what is the economic and community impact of the work that we do. So I am an economist. I'm a regional economist by training. I've done quite a bit of impact assessment in the past, not so much recently, but I think one of the areas that I'll probably be doing some work in going forward is trying to get a better handle on how do we actually go about in a good way measuring some of these things that we're working on. So let's see if I can forward my slides. I figured that out. I think one of the background pieces, and there's several slides here that are coming up that I think it's important for all of us to have some grounding in, and whether we're coming from, say, a community economic development program area, or ag, or food nutrition, or any other area, is kind of what is it that makes a local economy work, and kind of from a systems viewpoint, what are the constituent parts of a community and how do they interact with each other. And so I think having that basic understanding is kind of, for me, foundational to thinking about how might the development or enhancement of the local food system kind of play out within the structure of the local economy. And also on the second point here, a lot of people, and I guess I've worked in community economic development for more than 20 years now, and don't hear it so much anymore, but used to really hear this idea that, well, economic development is more important than community development and vice versa. You got to start with one before you have the other. I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that there's a lot of interactions there. There's some things that we can measure in terms of dollars and cents, and some things we can't. But that both are quite important, and there's quite a bit of interaction between the two concepts. So this is one of the earlier models that was kind of put out there. I believe this is from David Darling, who was an extension specialist at Kansas State. I'm not sure how far this goes back. It definitely goes back into the early 80s, kind of when I started my career in extension. I guess it would have been 1989 when I had my first position, and this predated that. But basically, this is a static kind of model, thinking about a local economy, and you can think about any geography for this you want. It could be national if you want, but the fact that any kind of particular region you want to choose has an economy associated with it. And basically, these economies differ from region to region. Some of them have more of these leaks in this rain barrel than others do. Some of them have more potential to basically bring dollars in from the outside. But the way the economy basically functions in this model is that if you produce something, a good or a service within that particular geography, and then you sell it outside of your region, the goods or services go out and dollars flow in. And once they flow in, they become part of the local system. They're in that barrel. They circulate. The multiplier effect basically is that recirculation where there's additional purchases being made within that region, and creates ripple effects throughout the economy. Now, what really mitigates how the extent to which those multiplier effects can be generated is how much leaks out at every change of the dollar. So every time an expenditure is made, is it being made locally or is it being made externally? Are there leaks in the economy? And sometimes it depends on what size your region is to a large degree, how contained that economy can be unto itself, because not every region can produce everything that the people who live in that region desire, and so they have to go outside for imports. Sometimes there's payments to higher levels of government through taxes and that sort of thing as well. You see on here. Sometimes there's things that we consume as imports that we don't necessarily have to be consuming as imports. We could be producing them ourselves. And this model, kind of recognizes that as well in this leakages of consumption dollars here. There's some other leakages in here that we all know very well. The whole brain drain effect, the high school graduates part there on the right, people that we educate and send away and they never come back. Estate settlements of land that gets broken into smaller parcels and that sort of thing, and the ownership of that transfers to outside the region. There are issues there with that as well, where wealth goes outside the economy. And then inefficiencies, I guess, mentioned there as well. So it's an old model. I think it's a very potentially useful way to think about, and a very simplistic way to use in your educational programs or whatever, working with other people to think about the basics. So this is just a list again of those leaks in the barrel that can generate issues for a community, and also provide some way to be thinking about opportunities for plugging those leaks. This is a list of economic development strategies that has kind of borne the test of time. It came from Glenn Pulver, and Ron Schaefer was also involved in this. They both passed on. They were at the University of Wisconsin. They were community economics professors up there, extension specialists who really, within the Wisconsin system up there and nationally, really helped set the stage for a lot of extension work in this area. And Glenn basically came up with a set of 5 strategies that any community can undertake to try to produce economic development. So the one that many of us are very familiar with, and definitely our state departments of commerce and others are very familiar with, is the Attract New Basic Employers. That's the one some people liken to smokestack chasing, buffalo hunting, that sort of thing. For a small rural community, it's oftentimes not the most productive strategy. There's a lot of research that says that it's something that doesn't necessarily generate as much benefit for any region, no matter how large, as some of these other things. Even so, we still put a lot of resources into that particular strategy. Another thing we can work on is improving the efficiency of existing firms. And there's a number of ways to go about that. Perhaps one of them that's out there right now that seems to be of interest is what can we do in terms of energy efficiency or water use efficiency and some of those sorts of measures. Or what can we do in terms of helping them to adopt newer technologies that might make them more efficient and make them more competitive, so they might be able to stay competitive in generating profits within your region. Improving the ability to capture dollars. So basically, this is improving exports out of your region. Encouraging new business formation is one that we don't see as much emphasis on typically as we do on the attraction, but it seems to be the new business formation. And also the companion to that, which is not listed here, is the retention expansion of existing firms kind of strategy. Both those working in parallel tend to generate more economic impact than some of the others, but and it's something that can kind of play out within this local food system area. And increasing transfers from higher levels of government. So in a static rain barrel model, we had dollars going out to pay taxes, but the more we can bring things like grant dollars and payments from higher levels of government into a local economy, they recirculate just like any other dollar in the local economy, so they can be pretty important for certain regions. One of the areas where you see this a lot in rural communities is oftentimes local government and the educational system, public education, is one of the most important economic engines of smaller rural communities. And a lot of those resources are coming in from the outside. Okay, so I came across this just a couple weeks ago. Michael Wilcox at Purdue. I just stole his slide and put it in here so you could take a look at another model where he was speaking about entrepreneurship, and this is a small business development piece. And I think a lot of this is very relevant to our local food system development work, because we're I often refer to them as kind of food system entrepreneurs. And in many cases, I think they kind of fit the bill. Not in all cases, but oftentimes so. And meaning that there's quite a bit of innovation and creativity involved in their work, and oftentimes that has spillovers into potentially other parts of the community. But this is kind of a three-legged stool. He's talking about new business creation. He's talking about recruitment from the outside and retention expansion, some kind of balance implied there. There's some linkages between them. And they're all resting on the environment, and there I believe he means about the natural environment. And basically that's the foundational piece. If we destroy that, then we can topple the whole system. This is a model for those of you who want to try to get some perspective on, what's the difference between community development and economic development. I think oftentimes this model, and there's another one coming up in a bit that can be helpful. Basically, this is Mark Peterson from University of Arkansas. His contention is that all of it fits within community development, including economic development. It's a subset of what we need to do in our communities. But there's more that we need to do than just economic development. And that strong communities have this leadership infrastructure in place. They have the human and social capital in place. And then once you have that in place, basically you can begin building these other pieces, the support systems, the infrastructure, and then the economic base kind of fits up on top of that. And so that's another kind of model to think about in terms of local food system development being broader than just what we typically think of as economic development, but also touching on some of these components of community development down at the bottom of that model. And this is David Darling from Kansas State, 2004. I think this is probably, he retired around that time probably, so it's probably one of the last things he put together. And in this is a similar kind of model to what Mark Peterson put together, but you can tell it really implies in what he saw as priority. He saw the attraction strategy as being kind of the top of the pyramid, not meaning it's most important, but that it's not foundational. It's something you do once you've got all the other pieces put together underneath it, and that it really doesn't require or shouldn't require as much attention as some of the other things. So, a lot of regional economists, community economists, for a long period of time have been kind of battling this idea that attraction from the outside is economic development, where there's broader dimensions of economic development that really we ought to be paying a whole lot more attention to. And I think this was his approach to try to say that we've kind of got our priorities messed up, and we need to make some adjustments. There's the Community Capitals Framework. This is by Neil and Jan Flora. There's a lot of traction with this, I think, especially in North Carolina. I think many of you read an article that I was a co-author on that made mention of Community Capitals Framework being used in North Carolina to try to get a handle on impact of local food system development. I think it's a very useful construct to be thinking about what are the various dimensions that we need to be paying attention to in terms of capital. So capital is kind of a stock of some kind of a resource, not necessarily a flow, but you can think about it also in terms of, are we expending some portion of this capital, or are we building up some portion of this capital? It's more of a flow concept then. So we can get stocks and flows of capital considerations involved in our work. And I believe the next slide here I have kind of goes through and gives you a brief definition of what each one of those are. So the human capital, knowledge and skills, social capital, this trust and working relationships in a community, very important. political capital, influence, at higher levels, basically. Financial capital, the one we think about most of the time, I think, because it can be measured in dollars directly. Natural capital, of course, our natural environment, and engineered, the things that we make. So, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time telling you specifically how to go about doing economic impact analysis, for example. This is really to be kind of an introduction to some broader concepts to be considering, and I will point you to, I don't think I have it here in the article, but or in the PowerPoint, but there's a fairly recent article that came out. Catherine Boys from NC State, she was at Virginia Tech prior to being there, and David Hughes, who used to be here at Clemson, he's now at Tennessee, an article they just came out with in Choices magazine, which is, if you go to AAEA.org, that's American Ag and Applied Economics Association's website, you see a link for Choices magazine, and they have a number of articles out there, besides the one that you all read that I worked on, that relate to local food systems, and there's more and more on this economic impact measurement and whatnot. And what we're finding is that no one's really completely figured this out yet. We don't necessarily have the data. We don't necessarily have the methods for doing this in a really precise way, but there's a lot of people working on it right now, trying to figure this out. But in terms of the mechanisms for producing economic impact, I kind of mentioned this import substitution, so plugging the leaks in the barrel, and I think this is probably the one that most people think about in terms of developing local or regional food systems. Kind of identification of what are those long supply chain interactions that are occurring right now that are bringing food into a community from great distances. The whole food miles argument kind of centers on this, and reducing those food miles and trying to basically substitute tomato that might have been grown in California with one that might have been grown in North Carolina or Virginia or South Carolina, those sorts of notions. And yes, that can be a mechanism for sure for plugging the leaks in the barrel, helping dollars to circulate more, and basically not allowing, reducing the imports and doing more for generating the local economy. So that's one area. The other is, once you kind of get a critical mass of things going on, and it's this idea of creation of new businesses. That could directly be new food businesses. It could be farmers. It could be restaurants. It could be those involved anywhere along the supply or value chain. It could be that they work in concert with each other. They work independently, so it could involve some clusters. Along with those food businesses, there might also be input suppliers. They could be new businesses, or they could be existing ones that have found new markets because there's a more robust local food economy occurring. Some other areas of value-added processing, packaging, handling, the whole supply chain, basically. And this idea of synergies across the value chain, where we get what we call agglomeration effects, and that is where by kind of collaborating with complementary businesses, or even with kind of competitive businesses might be offering some of the same things, but by working together, you're able to achieve some kind of economies of scale, reducing your cost of production, potentially reaching new markets with product. In each one of those cases, there can be additional economic impacts that accrue. So some of our efforts to help develop market structures, to bring people together into various kinds of organizations, food policy councils, growers groups, that sort of thing, where people find each other and begin to collaborate in ways that makes good business sense to them, can also generate economic impact. this idea of an enhanced entrepreneurial climate. I think many of us who work with these small businesses that are working in the local regional food system domain find that many of them are quite creative, and they kind of create a different atmosphere within a community, perhaps a more entrepreneurial kind of atmosphere, and that can, I guess, help our support organizations within any given community to maybe come alive a bit more and help not just the food system players, but perhaps other businesses in the community too, other small businesses. So I think there's a lot to be said about that. We don't necessarily have good estimates of how much that's worth or anything, but it's an area that's ripe for research. Another area, another mechanism that I think some of us point to is this amenity base of any community to attract other businesses, residents, or tourists. The idea of the culinary tourist is alive and well. I think probably many of us right here on the seminar, as we travel across the country, you may travel with a cooler in the back of your car because you don't quite know what you're ever going to run across that might be interesting to bring back home. So it could be food that's prepared and you consume there in the community, or it could be something you bring back home with you. But in any case, that represents some economic impact potential. So that's the tourist piece, but also it could be that having this robust local food system is important to particular types of creative economy businesses. When they're making location decisions, that may be an indicator they begin to look for, because it helps them to attract creative employees. It's just part of the cultural mix locally. And sustaining local residents as they're making, either you're attracting new people or as people trying to make decisions about whether they're going to leave and go somewhere else, having some of these amenities in place may be beneficial. Again, we don't necessarily have good research on this, but it's just an area where we think that it's a mechanism where potential economic impact could accrue. Another area and a lot of people who are really focused on maximizing the local in local food systems oftentimes overlook this, and it's something that only particular regions probably will find success with, but if they can, it can be a great benefit to them, and it's just kind of like a phase two in my mind in terms of creating these food systems, and that is developing signature local products. If you go over into the European context, you'll see a lot of this. You'll find food and wine, and in some cases handicrafts and that sort of things, handmade items or items that are made using a particularly traditional, perhaps, production method. The government has, at the EU level and the French level, for example, Italy has a similar structure. A lot of countries in the EU do, where you've got geographic indications of origin that are affixed to these products, and you've got legal protections to allow you to basically identify, develop, and market a product using something like the AOC or AOP, if you're familiar with those. And others can't come in and claim that their product that was produced somewhere else is the same as yours. So it requires you to have a high quality local product that's marketable outside, but I think in some regions we can do that. And again, that then becomes an export item which brings brand new dollars into the economy. It's not just about recirculating existing dollars. Some of the areas that many of us point to that we think this is true, and there's some evidence out there in the literature, is that by having a more robust local food system and having availability of fresh fruits and vegetables, we can impact health and nutrition. And I think that's an area that's very ripe for additional work, but it's definitely something that could be a lever for producing economic impact. This increased access to affordable nutrition, regardless of income level, is something that I would say it's related to this health and nutrition, but I want to put a separate bullet point in there because oftentimes folks that are interested in local food system development are criticized because they may be seen as developing a food system for the elite, well-heeled people in that community, and not necessarily focusing on affordability. But I think if we can create food systems that can also pay attention to those sorts of issues, then we can be perhaps impacting people that, in terms of economic impact, are most likely problematic in terms of, a lot of the health issues that those people are facing. We end up paying for that not in a prevention mode, but kind of too late in terms of the life cycle of those problems. And so if we could intervene earlier, I'm sure that we would find that there are economic benefits to increasing access to affordable nutrition. A lot of people mention decreased environmental externalities. The food miles argument is out there. It's been debated whether or not local food systems do any better on food miles or not when you put the whole system together, because these long supply chains are very efficient. They don't waste trips up and down the road as often, perhaps, as some of the local food systems do. It's still to be kind of seen what the truth is there. But there may be other ways, production methods that are used and whatnot might also be easier on the environment. And this idea of increased social capital, social capital being a stock of kind of the networks and relationships within a community that everyone can benefit from, the local food system as well as other enterprises within the community. And I think when we think about our farmers markets and we think about why are people coming to farmers markets, I think we all recognize that it's not just because of the nice fruits and vegetables there. It's also, at least for many, a way for them to come and interact with other community members in a nice informal kind of third place kind of way. Okay, so I started kind of getting into some of the other areas where there might be some impact that might not be direct economic impact in the way we typically think about it, where we would say measure, we call these contribution studies in economic impact assessment, where we would study, would identify, say, a business or a sector, and we would look at where they make purchases, whether or not they're internal to the region of interest or not, and we would kind of go about measuring our economic impact that way. I think there's a lot of other areas that are maybe more difficult for us to measure, but nonetheless, they're probably actually areas where we would find eventually more impact. And I think in a later slide here, I'll bring up a couple issues there in terms of the traditional ways of measuring economic impact that might kind of lead us to the conclusion ultimately that there's not really a lot of economic impact potential if we measure things the way we kind of always have. So basically, here's some thoughts of it. Or can we identify what these exchanges of positive value are within the community that we can attribute back to local food system development? So we developed some kind of a model to characterize what this looks like. What are I'm thinking logic model, or maybe some other ways to do this, but basically, how does some aspect of a local food system relate to other components of the community? I think a logic model is a fairly decent way to start thinking about that. And then can we create metrics that clearly identifies and measures them? Is there existing data? Are we going to create new? How expensive is that going to be? Because we probably would like to track these things over time if we could. And actually, this last line in here, once the data is collected and synthesized, who's going to be interested in it? How are they going to use this to inform decisions? Perhaps that bullet point ought to be at the top of the list. If we're going to generate data, then we really ought to know what the purpose for it will be, and we should know how people are going to use it. Are there some key decisions that can be made in the community that might, say, enhance a local food system? If there are, and this data can be helpful, then perhaps we can kind of do the cost benefit on that to see if it's worthwhile going about and collecting it. Okay, so I'm going to lay out real quickly here kind of the standard economic impact assessment approach, so you can kind of see where there might be some shortcomings in this, and some strengths, but there might be some shortcomings in this unless we go about doing things a little bit differently. So basically what happens is, in any of these, is the region is defined. It's the economic impact of sector A, B, or C on region X. And that region can be very small. Oftentimes it's kind of determined by what kind of data is available. If people are doing economic impact assessment, then typically a county is kind of the smallest unit of measure that they use, because the data is available there from the federal government, and it gets worked into systems like M-Plan or REMS or some other kind of models that are out there. So you define the region, and quite frankly and quite basically, the bigger you define the region, of course, the fewer the leakages. So if you really want to create a larger economic impact, then you probably want to have a larger region. So there's some gaming that goes on in terms of how this work gets done. So you really need to think about what region is appropriate. And then the sectors, and typically within these kind of standard input-output analysis kind of approaches, those sectors are pretty well predefined for you. It's by the NAICS code. Once that data is organized, and to do anything kind of really different from that requires quite a bit of custom work. But again, thinking through, what sectors within that NAICS code are going to be selected is pretty important, and determines, again, the impact to a large degree. Again, the more you include, the bigger the impact. The next step is to basically define a baseline scenario. What's going on out there right now, kind of status quo. And I think in local food system assessment work, taking kind of a snapshot of what do the supply chains currently look like, what are the sources, the ultimate sources, basically, of the food products that are coming into a given region look like, because the typical approach to local food system assessment, again, as mentioned earlier, is that we want to try to shorten at least some of those supply chains so that they're coming to us more locally. So define that baseline scenario of what's currently going on, and define the change scenario, or kind of like, what do you ultimately want it to look like? Do you want to basically eliminate all long supply chains, or do you want to selectively do that, maybe picking off some of the highest priority, most feasible supply chains that could be shortened, and then taking a look at that, and then basically we look at the difference to get this to the multiplier effect, or to look at the change scenario. And so we just take the baseline scenario and subtract that out of the change scenario. Look at the difference. We run it through the model, and we take a look at then at what the results are. And one of the things that is rarely done in these types of studies is, say, in an attribution study where you're looking at the economic impact of a particular industry, is to say, let's say if we were going to develop a new industry that requires resources, factors of production, so land, labor, capital, management, entrepreneurship, those sorts of things. If we did not develop that particular industry, then those resources, those factors of production would not just go away or remain stagnant. They most likely would be used to produce something else, and typically the way we like to think about that is the next best alternative, kind of an opportunity cost idea. And oftentimes, I would say most of the time, they basically, this alternative use of resources is not considered in the study, because typically people have an interest in creating an economic impact statement that has the largest numbers possible in it. And if you start pulling out, well, what if we were to take those resources and do something else with? It could be that the change scenario is only marginally different from the baseline. Okay. And there's all kinds of underlying assumptions I won't go into right now, used in trying to make these economic impact assessment mathematically tractable, doable. And those assumptions then, if you go back to some of the fathers of economics, Keynes in particular, said something about the job's not done until we go back and test our assumptions one by one to determine if they were valid or not. And that's basically never done in these sorts of studies. So anyway, they should be done probably, but they're not done. So just keep that in mind as you look at economic impact statements, that there's a whole host of assumptions underlying them whose validity has most likely not been examined. And if you get a really honest report, then they may list those assumptions at least, but oftentimes you won't even find a list of what those assumptions are. Bottom line result is if you see a multiplier developed that is produced that's above about 2, then I would want to know more about the assumptions and what the details were that went into that estimation, because it really takes some pretty unique conditions to produce multipliers that are really a whole lot bigger than 2 or maybe 2.5. We sometimes see reports out there that say it's 7 or it's 9 or 27 or whatever, but boy, I'd like to really see the assumptions on those. Okay, some typical measures of economic impact you'll see out there. There's the direct, indirect, and induced effects, and if you want to get into the details of what those are, I can point you to some references, but basically the direct effect is basically when you add up kind of what is the, say, total sales from the local food system, and just stop right there without considering any kind of multiplier effect at all. The indirect is when you include basically the purchases within the region and capture that part of the multiplier effect, so the dollars that circulate within the local economy for making local purchases until it kind of bleeds out through that leakage that we talked about before, the leaky barrel idea. And then induced effects are really what comes from wage earners, employees, that sort of thing, basically earning a wage and respending those dollars locally as well. And again, if you're looking for a larger rather than smaller economic impact, then they will include the whole kit and caboodle. They'll include the direct, indirect, and induced effects typically in those kind of studies. But you just want to make sure that you're comparing, say, apples to oranges in one study to the next. They're including all of that. So other concepts out there, are output of the sector. So that's, basically the total dollar sales and that sort of thing. The incomes that might be generated. I guess I didn't list employment in there, but there's employment measures as well. And then value added. So value added is like taking the total output and subtracting off the purchases that were made, so you can really see how much value was created in the region and dollar value. because of the activity. So some important considerations. I've kind of laid out, maybe I've been a little bit cynical perhaps, I don't know, in some of my thinking here about economic impact studies because there's a lot of assumptions that go into them, and oftentimes those assumptions are not made transparent, and oftentimes it's kind of treated like a black box. If you really want to, you can try to collect that information from whoever did the work. But one of the things that I've found is you need to consider who's paid for the study and what are their goals. Because oftentimes, as the analyst is making decisions about those assumptions, you know, they can be influenced by who's paying the bill. So how transparent are the methods? Can they explain the assumptions? Or do they avoid these when you're asking about them? And ultimately, you know, if it's really an important decision that might be being impacted, say involving a large investment, for example, and they're putting a lot of weight on the economic impact estimate, then I think asking whether or not these results could be replicated by either by the same analyst or by someone else might be a beneficial question to ask, because if they can't be, that means that there's been a lot of kind of manipulation perhaps of the assumptions and they haven't necessarily been well documented. So just a few thoughts here to kind of leave you with. I think the economic impact of a local food system is really going to be determined by what's going on in the particular region. If there currently is, if it's a food desert, and you create a local food system to address that issue, making food available that was not being provided by any other means, then really the baseline scenario is kind of a blank slate, and whatever you do in that particular environment really kind of counts in a significant way. If it's an area that's already well served or pretty well served, then of course you wouldn't expect the local food system development project perhaps to show as great an impact, because the baseline was already fairly robust. So it really depends upon market conditions, what's going on locally in terms of consumers and what it is they're willing and able to purchase, either with their own resources or with those that might be spent on their behalf by government or by philanthropy or whatever. The production conditions, you know, what can be grown successfully there and brought to market. And then the policy environment, I think as well, is something to think about. You need to have an understanding of what's going on with local land use policy on the farming end, and what's going on perhaps in terms of small business development on more of the retail end. Would be something that you'd want to consider. So here's some final thoughts then. This local food system development is not a bullet, or it's not a panacea, not a silver bullet. When you think about those broader community economic development models, it's not necessarily going to foster community development, you know, unless it can impact some of those things that are more at the foundational level. Some of the social capital kind of pieces or whatever are quite important, and if developing a local food system component can help with those issues, and if we can measure those, then I think there's a lot to be, a lot of benefit there that we could capture. Local food system development really requires transdisciplinary, multi-sectoral approaches. So in terms of our academic institutions, it requires that there's some social capital going on between our units, people with different areas of expertise working nicely together. Requires that. And I think within the extension context, it requires kind of cross-program collaboration. Ag, community economic development, family nutrition, youth, all of them requires that sort of thing. And we don't often have structures to help us do this and, effectively. And so I think because rewards basically go back to our program structures. So I think there's work that needs to be done within Extension to create some innovative ways for us to come together. Economic impact is important, but it's not everything. But the degree that we can, we need to find ways to translate these non-economic outcomes into economic terms, at least to begin to try to get a handle on them, so that as we're discussing our activities and the benefit of them and kind of cost-benefit analysis of those, we're justified in what we're doing. Communities that are already kind of got their act together are more likely to be successful with local food system development efforts. It's just going to be easier to work with communities that are working well together, that have some social capital content. They don't necessarily need to be the most wealthy communities. Wealth probably helps, depends on what you're trying to achieve. But so long as they're working together, I think it makes our job a lot easier as Extension staff. And this idea of creating a local food system to serve the interests of higher income elites or low income folk, both of those have inherent values considerations that we ought to think about. Who is it that we're really trying to help, and for what reasons have we chosen those audiences to serve? What actions can a region take to foster local food system development? And I tell you, the NC State actually has kind of a toolkit coming out that a lot of these things are mentioned in, and I would point you in that direction. Maybe Joanna can put that link up there too, if it's available. So this idea of starting with asset identification and mapping those out in a community, a lot of us I think are already engaged in some of that. Strategic visioning and planning around food systems, stakeholder organizing, this idea of maybe organizing around food sheds, which I saw one at a meeting, I guess, where was that? At Asheville, I believe. I can't remember the meeting now. That someone put up a watershed map, and we all kind of agreed that, yeah, it kind of looks like food sheds generally. But this idea of food sheds and organizing around them may or may not be a region that people are used to collaborating across, and so there may be some challenges there. Identifying bottlenecks and gaps within the system, trying to access state and federal resources to bear on these issues. I think we can have a role there. The community can have a role there. And then, communities do this for other things, for water systems, transportation systems, and that sort of thing. They have capital investment plans. Sometimes those things are timed according to kind of revenue goals and that sort of thing in the community. But why not work with our local governments and planning folks to get some food system infrastructure kind of projects out there included in those, so that we're timing food system development along with everything else in the community. And that's all I have for the day. So if there are any questions out there that we could address, I'd be willing to take those.
Great. Dave, thank you so much. That was very interesting and informative. I did just paste the toolkit link, which is what I believe you were referencing, into the chat box. And that is something Becky Bowen has been spearheading. So folks, if you have questions, we're a small enough group here. If you want to raise your hand and turn on your microphone, I can call on you and you can turn on your microphone and ask your questions of Dave. Does anybody have a question? So while folks are thinking a little bit more on that, Dave, you talked a bit about the multiplier effects, and you gave a really good background on interpreting those and that type of thing. And I know that some folks in our course have asked for information on how to use those, or if you should or shouldn't use those. I think you give us some good cautionary notes about how to look at those from a more strategic perspective. But how, from your opinion, the use of multiplier effects as a benefit coming out of local food systems. Can you talk a little bit more about that specifically, and whether agents can use that as a tool, or how they might approach that as a tool? Our understanding is that they're very place-based, and so generalizations are very challenging.
Yeah, they are. I do think, it's one of those regional economics toolkit kind of things that we do have to work with, and it's kind of the best we have, perhaps. I think, it's going to be easier to do that and do it legitimately in a region where you're not basically displacing some other economic activity. So again, if it's like a food desert and you bring in some kind of a food sector business that's serving that region, that's a whole lot easier and tractable problem to get some reasonable estimates from, because you can look at that business, you can look at its number of employees, you can look at its expenditures and trace those back in the community. Again, if that particular business is basically making all of its purchases outside the region, then the economic impact is diminished. I guess you might still have some local wage earners and that sort of thing employed by that business. But if you can get them to make more purchases within the region, then that enhances. There's something called a regional purchase coefficient, basically, that's involved in this kind of input-output economic impact assessment. And that's basically what proportion of those purchases of each kind of category of purchases you make. So if you look at a business's, if you look at their income statement and you look at the expenditure side, each one of those categories of expenditure, you ask them, well, where did you make that purchase? What proportion was made within the region, or what was made out? Then you get to what a regional purchase coefficient is. So, yes, it can be done. I think it needs to be done with some care and some attention. It's going to be easier also, I think, probably to do in perhaps a larger regional context, where maybe, that's going to differ as well. So let's say if you have a larger regional context, you're more likely to pick up kind of what might be seen as local food system development enterprises or enhancements. So there's more to kind of get your hands around in terms of what do those look like, and there's probably more gross impact there. But then you're looking at that in a way as kind of a proportion of a larger economy as well.
Right.
And so just how big that economy is, and how important that final number is.
Right.
It's situational.
Right. Absolutely.
I don't think we shouldn't completely shy away from it because people want those answers. I think we should do our very best to capture at least the basic information about, say, the new businesses that you can attribute to local food system development, maybe new markets they can reach, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Any questions, folks? Well,
how we put them all to sleep? They skip their lunch.
Well, I'll ask one more, and I think it came from the Catherine Boy's article that you mentioned. I believe she raised the idea of inputs as an economic opportunity in local food systems. for example, what I feel like she was talking about was if the producers selling into local markets, had local suppliers of local inputs, that could be a great opportunity. Looking at potential waste streams within the community that could be turned into inputs to farms. Do you have thoughts on that?
As waste streams as inputs or inputs in general?
Well, thinking of waste streams such as feather meal, for example, as a fertilizer source from other areas in the food system.
Okay. Well, certainly, especially those, if a product doesn't have an effective use right now, and the market for it is not developed, whoever's producing that, what's an output to them, in terms of what would currently be considered maybe kind of a waste product, if you can convert that into a marketable input into some other production process, for sure, you've elevated the value of that particular product, and the person, and it could be that the person selling it, of course, will reap some economic benefit, but it could also be the person or the business buying that could as well, if it's a cheaper alternative to some other fertilizer source, for example. So yes, definitely there could be economic enhancements there in those sorts of situations. Inputs in general, one of the things that when you do economic impact assessment of, say, conventional farming versus more niche farming, smaller producers and that sort of thing, you often find, especially I did some work, I guess, up in the Midwest, that's where I come from. If you look at the long supply chains, larger commodity farmers in those regions they're buying their seed and fertilizer inputs and that sort of thing, oftentimes from fairly great distances, or it's just being kind of handled locally for final distribution. But a lot of the value goes back, it leaks out of that regional economy to somewhere else.
Right.
The smaller producers typically seem to have more potential for smaller businesses supplying them with inputs.
Great. Well, I'm seeing we're out of time. Dave, thank you again for this session. I wanted to also thank you for collaborating with us on the graduate course on local food systems and all of your time and energy that you've put towards that. But I also wanted to make you aware of a couple of other dates for webinars coming up that you can also attend. We'll be sending some information out through the same channels as last time for you all to register for those. In May, we'll have Growing Food, Growing Communities. We'll be looking at some case study examples of use of the Community Gardens community organizing tool. And then in June, we'll have Ted Fitzsands out of NC State talking about the role of extension in local food systems, distinguishing government policy and law. So stay tuned for that. The website you see here is where we'll post the recordings of this webinar, and you'll also see that we are posting recordings from the lectures and panel presentations and the course that's going on currently as well. So take a look there. And thank you all very much for attending. I appreciate it.